para compor agora o professor Rogério Kahneman, que vai estar conosco. O Rogério é nosso querido colega há muitos anos, fez pós-doutorado conosco, fez mestrado e doutorado, e pós-doutorado também comigo, né? Na minha orientação. Você também me atua há muitos anos já, e atualmente já fez conosco 2 longos estudos, né? De forma remota, durante a pandemia, e agora está nos ajudando também com esse, que é uma disciplina presencial. É importante dizer também que o Rogério hoje está fazendo pós-doutorado na PROARQ, Rio, e gentilmente, né, está nos acompanhando aqui também durante a disciplina. Essa é uma palestra aberta ao PROARQ, a FAO como um todo, né? E também compõe a primeira aula, que vai ser nossa disciplina, que é o CEL, né, Sistema de Espaços Livres, né, no formato internacional, e também o Globo Estúdio, só que dessa vez presencial. Nós já fizemos 2 edições, né, de forma remota, em 21 e 22, contando com o professor Mildred de Parsons, o professor Henry da Chinese University, conosco na UFRJ, com colegas também da PUC Campinas, alunos da PUC Campinas, de outras instituições, da PUC também. Enfim, tivemos em 2023, com o professor Perto, uma edição específica voltada ao IA 2023, onde nossos alunos, Adriano está aqui presente, né? Um prazer enorme que você esteja aqui de novo. Vários colegas participaram, mas Adriano foi uma das alunas da graduação que participaram, e o trabalho foi levado a Copenhague, né? A exposição dos trabalhos que foram levados lá para apresentação no Student Summit de 2023. O esforço dessa vez é ter um material que vá também poder ser apresentado, talvez, no formato de exposição, no seminário, enfim, no IA 26, que será em Barcelona. Todo o nosso esforço é sempre levar o nosso trabalho, os nossos alunos de graduação, os nossos alunos de pós-graduação, levarmos para fora do Brasil, atingindo outros públicos, também para a carreira deles, para a própria trajetória que esses alunos irão tomar daqui para frente. Eu queria agradecer também quem está sempre junto de nós, a Zelândia, todos os alunos que nos ajudaram, o Gai, o Ciclo, o Ana, enfim, estão presentes aqui, alunos já se formaram e voltaram, enfim. E também a colega que está presente aqui, a Éter, que está sempre nos prestigiando também, pena que os outros colegas não vieram. Enfim, então queria chamar a Rogério para compor a mesa, queria convidar a professora Andréia, que é a nossa coordenadora do programa, também para compor a mesa, e convidar o professor Henrique, daqui a pouquinho, ele virá para cá. Por enquanto, é só uma abertura oficial desse ciclo. Eu então passo a palavra para o Rogério, e em seguida para a professora Andréia.
Obrigado, Vera. Obrigado a todos que estão aqui, Henry. Então, mais uma vez a gente está fazendo essa empreitada do Global Studio. A gente fez 2 vezes que a gente fez online, né? Com os alunos de Hong Kong, de Nova York e daqui do Rio, trabalhando de manhã e de noite. A gente começava às 8 da manhã, 9 à meio-dia e 9 à meia-noite, durante uma semana. E a gente tem até uma publicação para mostrar como um trabalho de uma semana intenso pode produzir tanto conteúdo, porque às vezes a gente na universidade fica, às vezes, 4 meses numa disciplina, né? E eu acho que assim, esse esforço que a gente tem agora de 15 aulas, né? E normalmente produz algo muito bom, assim, porque são discussões intensas, tal. O Daniel já participou de sei lá quantas também, né? E eu acho que é isso. E o Ender que está aqui, que a gente só falou, né, por videoconferência, eu acho que é uma oportunidade de ter essa troca, porque ele é professor de Hong Kong, né? Eu morei em Hong Kong, sei Hong Kong tem algumas coisas muito parecidas com o Rio de Janeiro, então, e também tem a experiência pelo menos na questão de mobilidade, que eu acho incrível. Então, vai ser para quem participar, espero que todos aqui possam estar todos os dias, vai ser uma experiência maravilhosa. No nosso 4º ou 5º Global Studio. A gente vai fazer uma franquia bem mesmo.
Depois eu vou trazer os livros, né? Vou colocar aqui para você. Passar. Agora está funcionando bem. Depois eu apresento eles.
Bom, mais uma palestra do Ciclo de Palestras de PROARQ. Agradecer a Vera, os esforços, mais um Global Studio. Isso é muito importante para a produção do PROARQ. Temos disciplinas internacionais. Todo esse esforço é reconhecido quando a gente presta contas à CAPES. O Perto sabe muito bem disso. Enfim, a gente grava nesse microfone. Gostaríamos que a sala estivesse bem mais cheia, mas pelo menos vai estar depois no YouTube, né, essa oportunidade de todos escutarem e verem a palestra do professor Hendrik, que vai participar do grupo de estudos que começa à tarde. E agradecer aqui a equipe, né, fiel a Vera, que está aqui presente. Estou aqui clamando pela minha equipe, que não está tão fiel assim, para que venham à tarde participar do grupo de estudo, que eu acho que é uma experiência muito importante para vocês. Tá? Eu tive a oportunidade de ver os resultados do grupo de estudo na UBA e foi uma coisa muito bacana, sabe? Ver a exposição lá, no Itália, em Copenhague, é uma coisa, o livro, é uma coisa que é bacana, a gente se orgulha de ver. Tá? Então, seja um ótimo grupo de estudo, eu vou tentar ficar hoje à tarde, né? Estava lá construindo um caminho na Mariana, mas não consegui ficar o tempo todo. Tá? Mas é isso, um ótimo Globo Estúdio e obrigada.
Agora eu vou apresentar um pouquinho o currículo do Hendrik, que é um currículo extenso, porque ele está hoje como professor, né, na Chinese University of Hong Kong, mas ele tem uma experiência internacional muito forte. Então, o Hendrik é arquiteto, professor da Escola de Arquitetura, né, da Universidade Chinesa de Hong Kong, tem foco em desenho urbano e cidades sustentáveis. Ele é fundador do programa de mestrado em desenho urbano e diretor. Ele foi diretor da Escola de Arquitetura durante o período 21 a 24. Então, ele se conhece muito bem, né, o ofício de ser diretor de uma escola, né, de arquitetura. Ele tem mais de 20 anos de experiência em projetos comunitários de placemaking. Ele é curador também co-curador, né, da Bienal, da Pavilhão de Hong Kong, Transformative Hong Kong, na Bienal de Veneza, de 2023. Ele colabora no Habitat, também é diretor do Fórum Internacional de Urbanismo, o IFOU, né, que relaciona uma série de universidades no mundo inteiro. O Hendrik, além de vir para cá, ele está fazendo estágio pós-doutoral em Lisboa, já foi a Buenos Aires, né? Ele está também com colegas lá, tem uma série de relações também com diversos outros colegas no mundo inteiro, na América Latina, também em outros países, enfim. Então é uma experiência que ele carrega de estar em contato com contextos acadêmicos e universitários muito distintos. Eu queria muito agradecer a oportunidade, né, de estar aqui conosco, agradecer também a todos que estão aqui. É uma audiência pequena, mas com muita qualidade. Eu creio que vai ser um trabalho muito interessante. É só comentar que nós começamos hoje, essa palestra é aberta ao PROARQ, mas a disciplina inicia hoje depois do almoço, às 14 horas, com já discussões. O Rogério vai participar, vai apresentar um excelente trabalho sobre a evolução histórica do Rio de Janeiro, que é muito interessante para ele, para quem não é do Rio, né? Mas antes disso teremos o professor Hendrik falando sobre a metodologia que vamos trabalhar, e eu vou apresentar a parte mais burocrática, digamos assim, da disciplina, mostrando o cronograma, os mas não como foi o novo estúdio remoto, que foi uma semana, foram 10 aulas manhã e de tarde, então somando-se, né? Eram 10 dias de trabalho, 10 tempos de trabalho. Hoje a gente tem um pouquinho mais de tempo e isso consegue também nós focarmos com mais detalhe, concentrados nos trabalhos que vão ser desenvolvidos. Eu não vou falar tanto da disciplina, quem tiver interesse procure-nos de tarde, a gente vai explicar um pouquinho mais, mas lembrando que é uma disciplina que foca em intervenção. Diferente, não é muito uma teórica, uma disciplina que tem uma base teórica forte, mas também vai culminar numa área em projetação, em projetos, propostas, enfim, proposições. Bem, eu queria muito agradecer e pedir ao excepcional Henrique. Agradecer novamente a todos, e aí principalmente. Como parece.
Bom dia a todos, alunos, colegas e famílias. Muito feliz no Rio, finalmente. Meu idioma português, mas not very good, mas dia a dia melhor. Por isso eu falo inglês. But I made here some English words on the slides, and of course we are very fortunate to have Marco to translate them. Okay, thanks very much for the kind introduction, all of you, and let's start. So, the reason also why I'm here in Rio is, as you might see, there are some similarities maybe between Rio and Hong Kong, but then also certain things that are totally different. And so far, we run these workshops together, but I have actually very little idea how Rio works, Brazilian cities work, like see images. And I think I'm also here to learn from all of you, right? To understand the city and the South American urbanism better. So I think it's a bit more an exchange, right? Okay, let me start. This is basically where I work, the campus of our university in Hong Kong. And if you see the surrounding and so on, it could be taken probably in some areas in Rio as well. Right? Lots of islands and hills and so on. This is all School of Architecture. And I think we heard already introduction. I will not talk much about it now because the whole afternoon will be about the blue studios that we had. But of course, the reason to come here is also because I felt very connected to the team here and all the effort and so on. So I'm very glad to be here. Now, today I will talk about this topic, urban proximity, housing and public space. Actually, my work, I would say, is mainly public space, but I think it's interesting to see it connected with housing. And also this term, proximity, I will talk about it more, and maybe it's also something during the workshop we can once in a while come back to it and explain why. So in this lecture, and maybe Vera can give me some signs later if I'm too long, it's a lot of material, but I can cut it short, I'm sorry. So we'll talk about 5 points basically. So, well, I think you're actually, when I look at it, quite experienced probably already, so I don't need to explain too much about maybe what urban proximity is and so on, but maybe just from my side, why I feel it matters, and also the relationship between proximity and density. And then I think that Hong Kong is almost a kind of model of urban density and city development. A model it's very difficult to copy to Rio, but it's one that is in itself quite interesting. This model was never written and said, oh, let's do it this way, but it emerged as something, a tendency to develop the city over the last 100 years. And then I will look at what are the pros and cons, the performance of that. From there, I go into initiatives of re-envision this model. It's, to be honest, it's also a way to include a little bit my own work with the students and so on in Hong Kong, and also because Vera also mentioned, oh, you should maybe still include like some of those works. So it might not entirely answer everything about urban proximity, but it shows maybe more how we work in the city. And then a little bit of a summary at the end. Okay? So, and of course, the underlying idea is, okay, today there are many reasons why we live very dense together, right? It's not always by choice. Sometimes by choice, sometimes it just happens. But then it has some advantages in terms of sustainability also, right? As I will talk about it. But then how can we use this and really like it and live well? Because well, it's convenient, but it comes with some downsides as well, right? Okay, so if I start with this discussion of proximity, I guess many of you might be familiar with these ideas of Carlos Moreno and the idea of 15-minute city. I heard from Vera, you talk more about 10-minute city. Hong Kong in some areas it might be 10 or 5-minute city, in others not. So some of you might have seen this visualization of Carlos Moreno's ideas, and you might know that his ideas, they were formulated around 2015, 16 in Paris, and it was a time of the COP 15 or the meetings of where basically the Paris Climate Agreement was made, and indeed Paris until ago became really a challenge to basically try to really implement this. So I had the chance to be in Paris a month ago or something at a conference with Anne Hidalgo and Carlos Moreno, and it was quite interesting to see the impact in the city. So basically, what you see here is 15 o'clock, right, and then 15 minutes. Could we go to work to have health support, enjoy outdoors, and so on, right? And I think at the moment I live in Gloria, right here, and in an area like this, during daytime, nighttime maybe not, right? You might, it's already different, right? During daytime, it might be 15-minute city, right, or 10-minute city. Our campus here, 15-minute city? Not really, right? Okay. So, so it's in many cities, so you find maybe in the old historical areas before what cars were used and so on. It's quite easy to have these qualities, but then you are out, or then you are in a favela or something. Yeah. Certain things very convenient, others impossible to reach. But okay, so I summarized, also following the discussion of Carlos Moreno, those points, right? First of all, the ideas come also from the discussion of the Paris Climate Agreement, so reduce fossil fuel emissions related to climate change. And of course, in view of health, we can run, we can walk, we can take the bike and get everywhere, right? And And through that, if you don't use so much time for commuting, right, we have more time to spend with the loved ones, with our families. If you have kids, for example, and you stay, you're 1 hour and a half one way in the traffic jam and so on, right? That time you don't have for your family. And also we are more supporting the local economy, improve health and well-being, and also feel not so isolated maybe, right? And also it creates more inclusion and community ties. And indeed for Council Moreno and Anhil is really very much also about the political decisions about those neighborhoods and being involved in the democratic process to know your neighbors and decide or be part of the decision making and so on. Right? That's the ideal world, right? If you have urban proximity, and a beautiful idea. Then of course, just by being close to each other, it doesn't mean it's perfect already, right? This is a very famous photo. You all might have seen it before, right? This is not a photo montage, you know. I didn't have the one for Rio, but I'm sure you could have the Rio one as well, right? And this is about proximity, yes, right? It's very close to each other, but it's maybe not really to the benefit of people, right? How could we really create a proximity that is more inclusive and works better and so on, right? And, I don't have the answer for Sao Paulo or Rio, but I think it's very important, like, to study basically urban proximity, not only in new towns or in historical centers, but really with this kind of urbanism. That's also why I'm very interested to be here, right, in those kind of much more complicated situations. Okay, so now I talk a little bit about Hong Kong, where I lived for the last 19 years. So I went there to teach in the School of Architecture there, and while my Cantonese is still very very little, but I've been probably almost in every back alley of the city. So I try to explain a little bit how the city ticks and why it looks the way it looks. Okay, so the comparison again, if you look at both pictures, it looks quite similar, right? And probably even in terms of the climate, we can make more of these kind of comparative studies, but the climate might be also not too different, right? Tropical, hot. The densities and the number of people seems not so different. But the urban form, okay, you also have, I haven't been to the more high-rise areas, you have some, I think, here in Rio, but most of it is, of course, much more spread out in some areas, as far as I can see from the highway, and I haven't seen much yet. Just right. Okay, the reason for this is very much the topography, right, and land use, land ownership. What you see here is an aerial satellite photo of Hong Kong. Here's a little river, the Shenzhen River. Everything north of it is not Hong Kong, is Shenzhen, our sister city in mainland China. Both are part of China, but there's still a border. And with can you see the? You cannot see my spreader. On top there's the further is not visible. Yeah. I don't know if you have that. In the upper edge you see kind of very, on the Hong Kong side very green, and on the other side very dense. Okay. And then maybe just showing some pictures, right? This is not Rio, but I'm sure the areas like this. we also have those ones, right? So you might think Hong Kong is kind of all high-rise, but actually the whole point is you have areas extremely dense, extremely high-rise. So the old generation was 30 floors, 40 floors. We're going now to 50, 60 floors and so on, right? But others are still protected. So what you see here in the green, maybe it's also a difference, maybe two things important for you to understand. Why maybe it's a little bit differently organized than Rio. One is land, because it was a British colony, land is usually owned by the government and leased out. So that means that the government has much more power in deciding what is used for on the land, right? Which is not entirely true for the entire area, but we can take another time, right? But and there's a lot of income. Hong Kong is very low tax, right? And one way of making money for the government is leasing out the money, and ideally with a 50-story building on top, gives a lot of money that can be paid to us at the university and to many other public goods, while not paying much tax. Right? And through that have cheap products and so on that they could sell on the global market, right? And the other thing is that those green areas, 40% of the entire territory is protected country parks, and then there are still kind of buffer zones, so it's basically 60%. Only 25% of the area is urbanized, and only 4% of the area is used for housing. Of this entire area, only 4%. It's quite crazy, right? So, yeah. Okay, so I move on, but I think it's important to understand this. Because that's very important to generate a very unique urban form, right? So even other places try maybe to emulate or copy something, but the ownership system is different or other things are different. It's not so easy, right? Okay, now I will talk about three aspects now in this lecture particularly. One is public transport, very important, right? Housing and public space, because they are very essential for the experience of the city and how the city works, right? So one reason why Hong Kong sometimes was also used as a model for sustainability, even though you would say, well, is it good to look like this, is because everything is very dense, it's very convenient to get from one place to the other. So the relationship between urban density and energy used for transport and emissions is somehow related. Here's a graph already about 10 years ago, but I think it's quite similar, that shows the relationship between energy consumption for transport and urban density. American cities, maybe Houston, Phoenix, perfect. Okay. Here you see Houston, American cities, right? Very spread out. Of course, everybody has to go by car and so on, except of course New York. But you see in New York, on one level you see the density and consumption, right? And a lot of consumption on the very top, on the left side, right? The vertical. And the other one is the density. So even New York, compared to Hong Kong, is much less dense, which sounds strange, but once you are outside of the center of New York, the biggest city, it's also relatively low, right? European cities, here in this one, they don't have South American cities, sorry for that. European cities, maybe here, a good balance maybe between density and quality of life and so on, right? Well, I come from Europe. I don't want to say that I love to live in Hong Kong. Maybe also I can see also qualities there. But in this aspect is interesting, right? In Hong Kong, somewhere here, right? So meaning extreme dense and extreme low energy consumption for transport. We have energy consumption for air conditioning and other things, but for this one, it's quite interesting. If you talk about public transport, of course, the number one we're thinking of is the metro line. However, it's a very good metro system. But there are also other parts. So, for example, you see next to the metro informal buses that now were formalized, but they were basically first informal, those mini buses. Something maybe more, also maybe in South America, I don't know, but in some times there was not enough buses, and then they created just informally those, and then now they are formalized. And then we have these double-decker buses, we have ferries, we have cable cars, and taxis are relatively cheap, and there's almost like a public transport system because the distances are very short. So sometimes last mile or something, they also use quite a wider part of the population. Trams. Here, this is from a student work, also an international workshop with ETH Zurich that we did. So students from Zurich and from CHD. You see, 90% of the people around that use public transport. The car ownership for a place that is relatively rich is surprisingly extremely low. It's also very expensive to have a car park. Let's see, just a piece of concrete with a line around it costs basically the same money outside of the center, like my family home in suburban home in Germany. It's just a piece of concrete, right? Or what I pay in terms of rent for my car park is maybe like an apartment in Germany. But it's not needed also because you get everywhere with public transport. I have a car, I use it one time per week maybe. Or if you maybe your family, if you have maybe with kids or sometimes in particular situations, otherwise. And you can see the location of the metro lines and the urbanization is pretty much in the same places where you see the red on the map is also this right. And of course, there's an interest in the government to create because the metro system now is privatized since 2001, but the biggest stakeholder is the government. And of course, the more density around the metro station, the more ridership, right? The better for the metro system, right? But also good for people because they can basically, it's convenient, right? Because it's very good deal. So just some photos how this looks like. Now, Hong Kong, of course, pretty dense, right? So rarely, I mean, at peak hours, no way you would get a seat, right? You have to stand by on the main lines, right? But surprisingly, despite how many millions of people are kind of pumped through the system, that's still relatively okay, actually, right? It's really very, very clean, very safe, and so on, right? Now, one thing is part of this Hong Kong model, which is very unique, is basically that's the idea of how they work. Is basically you have the government, you have the metro, and you have the developers, mainly tycoons, probably 10 families or less that own those companies, like Li Ka-shing and so on, billionaires that have satellite dishes, satellites, not satellite dishes, satellites and TV programs, everything, right? And the way how, because the whole thing in Hong Kong is they want to have tax very low. So what they do is basically they develop the land around the metro, and the metro is basically a property developer and works with other developers together and builds entire cities basically, or extremely dense areas. And they cross-finance now, after privatization, after 2001, the building of new metro lines. Building metro lines is not cheap, because it's very hilly, you have to go through different under the ground and so on, but they're basically paid for by property development and shopping malls on top of the stations. So students made this kind of interesting graph. This is the yellow is basically the property development, and the other one is the profits through property development. Orange is income of ownership and management and renting out, also commercial, and then the others is basically incomes or not incomes, the gray one of operating and building new metro lines. And you see, like for example, in the last years, this was a lot of lower parts, right? But this is because they built several new lines and extended others. So they pay basically these enormous profits for all these new lines. So you get basically a grade A, one of the best metro system in the world, right? And MTR, the company, even builds it in other parts of Europe and so on, right? But basically everything without paying tax. You only pay 14% tax in Hong Kong, right? I'm from Germany, it's different, right? So it's interesting, because we have public universities, we have public transport, and so on. But it's also by the land lease, that's leasing out land and property development. These are big parts of generating money. Others tourism, we have others, but this one here? The gray, this is a profit of property development, property ownership and management, and rail-related money, right? So you see, up from 2001, it was privatized, and then they started to develop like crazy those huge developments, right? And made a lot of profit, and that basically allowed them to build all these kind of new lines and have basically deficit for that one for a time. But then when the lines are finished, of course, it becomes also a little bit better again. And of course, if you build so dense, you have also a lot of ridership, right? So I show you a picture of this. It doesn't look pretty necessarily, right? It's something like this. This has basically a PTI, a public transport interface, where you can change buses and other things and so on, right? It has a huge shopping mall, very luxurious shopping mall, and it has 11 towers on top, right? Super dense. Once you are inside, it looks very like an airport mall. It looks exactly like Dubai airport mall or something like this, right? Outside it looks more horrible, right? And but you can see already, that this model, it has its advantages out at the same time. Probably if you build the entire city like this. I must say that now not all development are as intensive. This is an extremely intensive development that was built with the new airport and for the handover, and then the connection to also the Airport Express and the expansion of the financial center to Kowloon and grade A office spaces and so on. Not all are like this. Now they also start to build other ones. But just to say that we saw this kind of interesting model, and you think like, oh, this sounds smart, right? but then this also looks like this, right? So yeah. So and you can see that around many of those metro stations, they built one shopping mall after the next shopping mall after the next shopping mall, often on top of when there was space, on top of those stations. But of course, if the line is in the existing area, then they cannot do it. Right? But some where they could do it, they exist. But it also means when you come out of the metro, you ended up always in a shopping mall, basically, in terms of public space. So you wouldn't see any other public space. You come out and you swarm in this kind of public space and private development, right? Okay, come to housing. I need to wrap up and deal with this fast. Okay. Very important, of course, for any city to work, right, is the relationship of affordable housing and different kinds of housing, right, for rich, medium, and poorer people, and also how they are related to each other. So basically, I don't know how the situation is in Rio. I assume houses are not very affordable, otherwise we wouldn't see many people living in favelas, right? So it would be very cheap, right? So I guess. But now, because also you can read it everywhere, also I'm traveling a little bit through Europe, to Asia, everywhere, housing affordability is crazy. If you were a student in Paris, some students might live in a tent, right? That's not like in Lisbon is a problem, in Barcelona is a problem, anyway, right? So Hong Kong definitely. Now, Hong Kong, interesting, in the city we have around 40% of the population that lives in public housing, both rental and ownership. More in the rental system and the others in the rental, in the ownership one. So 40% is actually quite high, right? If you go to Singapore, which is very similar, we always compare Hong Kong and Singapore because they have the same kind of financial services and British colony before and no more, and so on. So many similar size. They in 80%, Hong Kong 40%, and Manuel Castells also researched those cities. It's kind of interesting because of course it's very, very capitalist, right? Hong Kong is like, it's not neoliberal, it was always a kind of pirate or liberal place, right? But at the same time it is public housing, so it's interesting. There was a way to maybe pacify people and keep salaries low without having a revolution, right? To build the public housing, but also has advantages. I think it's genuinely advantages. I think there are some advantages for the capitalist system, but at the same time also brings benefits. Those that have public housing, they are actually quite happy. We pay a fraction of housing. Just to see a little bit how that developed. So those houses here, Chinese tenement houses, for example, you had maybe 20, 30 people in a little house in wooden partition living, many refugees at that time because there was a civil war in China and so on. After World War II, there were plans to develop Hong Kong in a different way. This is by Patrick Abercrombie. You might know Patrick Abercrombie. He did this London plan, basically to create this green buffer area, right? And then settle outside then new areas, right? New towns. And he came in 48 very briefly to Hong Kong after World War II. There were the Japanese during the war, and then when they were kicked out and so on, and the British came back. And then I think they wanted to make a little bit of better city afterwards, right? And so the idea to de-densify the city and preserve certain areas in green and then have less dense areas as new towns around, a little bit going back to the Garden City idea and so on, right? A little bit like this is developed, but what they didn't know at that time also, that was basically, there was 48, 49, the People's Republic of China was created, and well, it's a liberation, but we had basically every 10 years 1 million people coming to Hong Kong, mainly from China, over, and in a place with very little resources and so on, and like every 10 years 1 million is quite a lot of people to accommodate, right? I think it's similar to Rio, right? I don't know the numbers here, but very fast growth. And that basically led to a lot of informal settlements, usually, not surprising, always along the hills. And then what happened was then that in 53 there was a kind of very big fire, and in Christmas Eve, and 50,000 people became one day, basically, or one night, homeless. And so the government, there was very laissez-faire, created then this first resettlement estate for these slum or informal settlement residents to accommodate them. Within 1 year, I think they finished it and moved the people in there. However, however, not immediately all the informal settlements were gone, because still people continue to flock in, right? This photo I always find interesting. It's something I show to my students, not because it's not Rio, it's Hong Kong, right? Or maybe I don't want to be impolite, but probably you wouldn't think that this is Hong Kong, right? Or maybe you don't know. So there were many, also many informal settlements in Hong Kong. I hope I didn't provoke anyone, but I think that. But it's interesting. Was the situation in Hong Kong? Of course, yeah, it was a Copenhagen, but just to say. And maybe in the 1960s, we also had this kind of very violent riots. It's also the time of the Cultural Revolution in China, but also a lot of young people that were dissatisfied with the opportunities for young people and so on. So what happened afterwards was that usually in Hong Kong very laissez-faire, very capitalist and so on. But there was a certain kind of window where maybe there was really more a genuine attempt by the government, still British colonial, but in those years, particularly after the 60s, after the riots, and in the 70s and 80s, to change and really improve the condition for the Chinese local population, which wasn't the case before, right? So this is the first Wafu estate. We call it sometimes the sea view estate because it's kind of very beautifully located on Hong Kong Island, not far from the financial center, and even with beaches below and so on, and was also a little bit more than the last resettlement estate that I showed before, because this one had already like community facilities, some stores and so on. So on the way to almost like a little bit like not a new town, because it's all a public housing estate, but already a more comprehensive program. But then in the beginning of the 70s, under Murray McLaughl's, the new governor that came in I think 71, a big 10-year public housing and new town program was launched. And you see, then you have basically something like this, right? Where you see everything was flat in Hong Kong, maybe similar to here, is artificially reclaimed, not because the hills, they go just like this into the water, right? And you see something flat, it's usually artificial. And then basically this is Shaki Newton, that looks maybe horrible. However, if you go there, I would say it's one of the best new town. A part of the ecological part maybe to build into the water, that's maybe not a good thing. But if you go there, I would say it's probably the best new town that I have seen so far. Because I think at that time they had a certain idea of being socially balanced and also offer not only housing but also jobs to a certain degree. Our university is basically around this corner, so that means there are also universities very nearby, also has food jobs and other things, right? And what you see is basically a combination of public housing. Often they start with the public housing and private housing, and now, basically after completing routes like this, right? Along the water, always public spaces, parks. In the middle, a concentration of probably 5 shopping malls, all connected. But you can walk in walking distance. You're over and you are in public housing, right? Everything super close together, right? Also, if you compare, because we have all these kind of cross towers, of course we know these models, right? It looks very similar. However, it's not similar. You see how far they were spaced out. Like, it's very different to the kind of mixed use and vibrancy of those places. If you go, it's full of people, vibrant, very easy to go from one place to the other, public markets, and so on, right? It's not necessarily beautiful architecture, but in terms of a new town where no matter if you're rich or poor, you can get along around very easy, access to public space, to schools, to universities even. So now for middle class people, charting is still very, very popular to the city. It's one of the most. Now I come to the third part of that model, is basically the public space, right? So if you look at, for example, the planning of Sharjah Newtown, it's interesting in 1976 already when they made the plans for it. They draw, for example, this plan, right? And you can see that there was a very clear idea that there should be a system of green spaces and already cycling networks and pedestrian networks that holds it together. The hills around it are basically protected, right, in green. Every new town in Hong Kong has a park, a big park, right, but also this network of cycling tracks and so on, right. Today, new towns in Hong Kong are not planned like this anymore. Interesting, this was much more integrated. So if you go, like, for example, from one side to the other of the river, and then you can go hiking behind, right? And now you can cycle probably 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers non-stop. So I do that 3 times a week or something, right? And these are the public space, for example. It's a bit kind of aged as a design, maybe, and so on, but it's basically public housing, right, for the really very, very affordable, very for the poor population of Hong Kong. This is quality of public spaces. I think it has a certain dignity, right, and is entirely safe and so on, right. Here you see basically this kind of cycling network. Here you see a planning of another of those in the 80s, early 80s of public housing estate, for example, Mailam Estate. We studied this with our students to show you it's not only public spaces, open space, but also public facilities. Right? So we have a research with Global Public Space Program of Human Habitat, and it could be very interesting to ask you about maybe how you think about public space, public facilities here in South America, and I would be super happy to have somebody write case studies for us for our report. But in that generation, I don't want to, there's many things that don't work in Hong Kong, but I think from the 70s to the 90s, there was a window of relatively well-designed public housing areas, and why they work also quite well, and because they have, here for example, students draw this, second-year students, you see basically areas like playground, sports, a big sports area, commercial, public transport, walking distance to metro line. It's everything there, right? In reasonable, actually quite interesting architecture design even, right? Or here's another one, that's one of my favorites, Hang On Estate, a beautiful estate from the 80s. It's very close to where I live, so if somebody comes over there, the towers, they're always very generic, very same, because to mass produce units, but very small inside. But when you come out, it's nice, right? It's safe, it's green. If you compare to maybe many HLMs and public housing in France, for example, maybe a double-size apartment and maybe a beautiful tower, but you come outside and you feel unsafe, right? And so it's kind of an interesting way. You know, usually every place is a public market. So I would say here that you can see those areas in terms of 15-minute city, right? Many things of the everyday life you're very close by. Also, what you for work, not so much. Hong Kong tried to answer this by having a super efficient metro system so that you can be very quickly at work, but then it depends. Some of the public houses, the new towns, were built very, very far away in the 1990s, 2000s, and then it's a problem. Huh? If you take maybe more than an hour to get somewhere and so on, then for commuting and so on, then more difficult. Okay, performance, this kind of these ingredients, right? Or what?
Let's go and read some water if you need to do
Oh, thank you. Okay, performance. So now we say like, oh, with 15-minute city, no, would be great. We have all this and so on. Now, how does it perform? Of course, this was not necessarily designed with those goals in mind, but Charlene, I think they had a clear goal of being inclusive and job together. So I talked already about this in terms of transport efficiency. Well, Hong Kong works quite well, I would say, right? Now, other aspects. There was a very fascinating conference by LSE, London School of Economics, in Hong Kong in 2011, already some time ago. But I think still I like this document. You can download for free from the Urban Age website. A nice comparison to name as health and well-being. That was before the pandemic, but of course, you know, already at that time people were interested in this. Now, this one, maybe, I don't know if you can digest it from so far away and so on, right? Maybe later you can look at the slides or you can download it. I think it's a very interesting comparison. We have also Sao Paulo, we don't have Rio. And you can see different aspects like maybe GDP, life expectancy, crime, and so on, right? So you get a little bit of a sense of, like, for example, Hong Kong is a place with one of the highest wealth gap between rich and poor. So people that are rich, I think they're much richer than what I know in Germany usually or somewhere, right? And those that are poor, really poor. Interestingly, in terms of crime, not so much. Actually, much safer than New York and stuff, right? Also, we have a lot of domestic violence. That's kind of very small. Maybe it's a different society and so on. Maybe see. Now, so now in the meantime, life expectancy even higher. So it's, because when you see the high rise and so on, and the images, I'm sure you've seen the images of Hong Kong. You think, how can somebody live there, right? That cannot be healthy, right? But actually, people live, it's almost one of the highest life expectancies in the entire world, right? So there is a relationship between also density, and also Taipei, Tokyo, they all have usually very, very high life expectancy. But again, it's not a guarantee, not every dense city. There are other dense cities that are not so good. But that is life expectancy. Of course, the other thing is this kind of living well, right? If you look at life, quality of life, of course those rankings, they are also a bit obscure, right? Because they are more for expat and so on. But still, they have like some interesting. There, it's interesting that Hong Kong even has one of the highest life expectancies in terms of quality of life. Seeing that it's a very rich city and so on, and good public housing. 71 is not a particularly, I think, Singapore's 25, right? So Hong Kong government probably, they are always comparing and competing with maybe like Argentina and Brazil. I don't know much. I don't know if you have this, but we have Singapore and Hong Kong. They are always competing for resources or expats and so on, right? And of course, it's a little bit embarrassing for a place that is so rich on the other hand, right? Of course, one thing might be related to, I mean, this is the environment and particularly the size of where you live, right? This is a comparison to Tokyo, which is also not necessarily known for big apartments, I believe, right? And here, average apartment is 65 square meters, in Hong Kong 40, but that's on average. And then, of course, Hong Kong is one of the most expensive cities in the world, usually with also Singapore and wealth gap, and so supposedly around, this is already a little bit older, but every fifth lives under the poverty line. Although it's a question like how exactly you define it, but and this is the kind of reality for many people, right? So subdivided flats, so apartments that get subdivided by wooden partitions, rented out, and living or getting a place like this might still cost you $400 or $500 per month or more. Maybe $500, 400. I don't know what's in Rio, but we don't see so many maybe homeless. We have homeless also, but we have people living in those or even in cages, right? The small cages. So the problem is also that not everybody qualified for public housing, right? If you're single, much more difficult than you have a family. Certain kind of foreigners have more difficulties to qualify if you don't have a Hong Kong ID. And the biggest problem today is maybe for we call it a kind of sandwich society, particularly for, let's say, our students or young people. If you graduate, for example, and you start, say, as an architect or something to work, you have actually income that is comparable. If you would hear what they get, you would say, oh, it's okay, right? But with that, of course, you're way beyond what you can earn to get into public housing, right? And then, but then to get into the private one, it's kind of super expensive, you know? And to buy an apartment for less than maybe 800,000 to $1 million US dollar is difficult. In a size that is kind of family size, right? Or you need to go very far out, but then there's not really, there are not so many places far out you can buy, for example, right? Or rent is also extremely expensive. So maybe family size apartment, you pay maybe something like between 1,500 and 2,000 US dollar, and then as a young person, it's difficult. And you might have heard we had a lot of protests in the city and recently, also related to it. Okay, I think I need to be a little bit faster. There is a trend also of privatization, right? Like what I showed you before, Shatin, beautiful, very well integrated public spaces, private public housing, commercial spaces. On the other side, there's no affordable housing integrated in that one, right? This is just a kind of isolated island, right? Connected to the metro, of course, and to even better, you can buy car. There's the best car parks you can have, but of course, extremely expensive. Maybe around in this one, maybe 5,000–6,000 euro per month, or US dollar per month rent. As a professor, sorry. And then the privatization of public space. You have those kind of spaces where a beautiful fountain, but designed that you're not sitting there, and signs everywhere. Don't sit down, right? And don't stay. Of course, we have torrential rains, climate change, typhoons. We're also affected by those kind of things, right? So another thing in terms of challenges is aging society, right? So I don't know if you can see from behind, but basically projection, you can see how the white part is the growth of the elderly people over 65, and basically now already changed rapidly, almost doubled to 2016 and 2030, almost doubled already in that time. So it's pretty dramatic. Okay, I don't know how is it time-wise. Can I still talk a little bit more, or yeah, okay. Because what I want to do now is still a little bit show you what we did with our students as part of the education, but also working with local communities. Now, we couldn't change, let's say, the proximity, because we worked on public space and we didn't have the resources to build new housing or something, right? But we were searching, we launched a new urban design program and urban studies program, and we were at the same time starting to engage with these kind of community placemaking projects. And also as a way for our students, many students are from mainland China, don't know Hong Kong and so on, to get accustomed to the city, but also for us to learn by doing, right? By really engaging with the city. And focus particularly on an area where a new metro line was extended. As I said, Hong Kong, also China, in that period, China in almost every city was kind of rolling out one metro line after the other. And which is good, I think we all support that. But at the same time, it's a question, what are the effects on the local community, and how maybe other government agencies are either helping or not helping. No? So, for example, you have certainly the upgraded area, this gentrification, right? And then maybe government can be buffering those a little bit. or can be at the forefront in evicting people and build expensive developments. In Hong Kong, basically what happened, they tore down entire street blocks for example, in this relatively old neighborhood, Siam Pool, which we looked at for over 10 years. So the research project was basically 5 years before they opened the metro line, and then 3-4 years after the metro line opened. And we were quite interested in how the public space around those metro lines are changing and the community life. And on the other hand, because we could see those tendencies of a lot of new people moved in that are usually much more richer, of course, and then how the local community reacts to that, and to see how we could rebuild a sense of community between the old residents. So students would do design projects in that particular area around this kind of, but these were the new developments by a government agency and private developers that would build these kind of super expensive apartments. Also, as I said, maybe rent at something like 4,000, 5,000 US dollar per month, and before maybe the rent in the same neighborhood were 1,500 or 1,000. So, and then also what was surprising is the quality of public spaces in the area was not particularly great. So they spent billions for the new metro line, but very little to upgrade the area and make it more pedestrian friendly and so on. Because they built a metro to take people out of the car, but then they don't really make the pedestrian environment better to walk around. So we focused particularly around this. We started at one space, a center street that looked quite deserted, and like a concrete slab, and it was already low car traffic because it's too steep. But there was often so empty like this. Before it was like this, there were informal markets and so on, and in many parts of Hong Kong at that time, they are already early, but in other areas they kick out the street markets because they think tourists don't like the street markets, but actually tourists like the street markets, and the residents, it's a bit strange. So we were thinking, like, can we bring people together and rebuild community after a renewal and so on. And then we developed a project that I think very much already, and this is already kind of over 10 years old, but I still think it's a nice project. So we had this kind of idea. This is a time of technical urbanism. Many people did those things, right? It was basically 2012-13 that we started with this project. It's basically the same like these other techniques. But what we tried to do, not because you've seen probably those kind of projects many times, but what we tried to do with that to invest into the kind of local community and basically work for a whole year with local school, because we felt in Hong Kong people are not very interested in public space. At that time, we're not much interested in public space, but they are very interested in the school of the kids. Now, that's the most important thing, right? Asian society. And so what we did, we worked with this local secondary school, and we worked with our School of Journalism, which is quite famous in our university. And I felt that we're architects are very good in design, but we're not good in communicating. And so we worked with the School of Journalism and Communication together with a colleague there. And then I also had a very good research assistant who was a freelance journalist. And so we would teach secondary school kids to be our community ambassadors and to make video films, video interviews with the of the neighborhood, right? Because if we go there, we always felt we did a lot of observation, like William White of the neighborhood, but always from a distance, like in a Zoom, right? What are they doing? But we want to have more inside perspective and linking the people, the school kids with them. We had the parents. And then with the people on the films, we had the kind of local, and they were basically interviewing the people about the changes in the neighborhood within major line and so on, right? So here you see Johnny, who then actually decided to study film, and he's now like a little director. And another one of them went to architecture and so on. And they made basically interviews with these kind of, this area was famous for a lot of old Chinese stores, with all grandmas and so on. Sometimes ladies over 80 years old still come every day, but not so much to sell something, but it's kind of, the shops were their social life, right? And then at the end, what we did, and I can show you was then to make this big event, which we planned for Moon Festival. It's always September, October, because Moon Festival is the only place where many people come all in the public space with lanterns and so on. We knew, that's where everybody go outside. So we cannot design the moon, right? But we planned this in 1 year ahead, so we had it exactly on that day. And then had this kind of maybe a little bit less loud here. Can you still hear me? Yeah? Okay. Sorry. And then we have basically designed these kind of events where we would bring people together during daytime. Students would kind of, actually our students would basically prepare the menu, and kids play around and so on. And in the evening, I will show a video. In the evening, we will show these kind of video interviews that were done by the secondary school kids, and we helped them basically over a whole half a year to edit the movies and so on. And many people do these outdoor cinemas, but I think what I liked in the atmosphere there was basically, it was very quiet. It's not like loud music and so on. It's basically people talking about the neighborhood, right? They just kind of say like, I have these kind of concerns or those, and then after 2 videos we would always stop right on the street and then discuss with the residents what do you think, share something, your experience and so on, right? So yeah, so I think a nice experience, but of course it's just a one-day event, right? And of course you can what did you change, right? And indeed, so for us, we more saw this as a kickoff. Hong Kong has public participation, but the public participation is very, at that time, maybe it's changing a bit, is not inspiring at all. It's basically a big room. Here you have all the officials, right? They're the community, and then you have maybe people say, we want to have more money for distances and so on, but otherwise there's very little discussion, right? And we felt like we have to reboot this way how people think about the neighborhood, and we use something like this as a kind of first warm-up to be interested in the place and start a conversation and appreciate the space, and to see, this space that we know from every day could actually, with very cheap means, people took off their shoes and were lying on the ground and said, this could be a nice place, right? But of course we were aware this is it's just a starting, can only be a starting point. So we came back then next year, and of course always with a new group of students, like always need to invent something new, like ambition for ourselves. So the next one was, this was more a virtual space with video. The next one to do something a little bit more tangible. So we let students design street furniture. So their job was, these were students, second year students that never designed something. Urban studies, not architecture. And I organized for them a little bit of a budget. So each group had a budget of some money. And the aim was to build a set of tables, right? And people together, and certain kind of program, something that those people would do, right? To to really talk with each other. Because we know the most beautiful public space doesn't mean that anyone talks with each other. They're like elevators, the best example. So. But in Hong Kong, like for example, dim sum, if you sit around a table, you have something keeps distance, but also sets the kind of social rules of talking with each other, right? More relief, right? But the fun was so designing a table, of course, super easy. You don't need a whole term for this, but then if you do it on a slope, it's much more difficult, right? So they did this, right, and then they did this, right, designing those things, right, and then they did this. And it's basically the coursework, right? So, and we let people in the community then make stickers to grade each item. Each group had 6 by 6 meters. And we worked together with, the reason also for that project was that we worked with a cappella groups, music groups from Taiwan and from Hong Kong. There's a certain kind of dynamic between, Taiwan has a lot of experience in community design. And even with this and so we worked with them together, and at that time it was still possible to do those things, but now, and basically music also brought lots of people, right? And then and then after the music stopped, people started to talk, and the students had to source locally the food and so on. Then maybe I'll show 2 more of those things, and then slowly I come to the end, and I might show 2 very short 3-minute videos how that theater can look like. We moved on because we have this ambition for ourselves. We cannot just, even that is not really changing the neighborhood. So next one we call magic carpet, magic tables, magic spaces. The next one we're more thinking like how can we now come to some kind of real. It's now in Hong Kong at that time the only thing you could democratically elect is the district councils. At that time, now it's a little change. We still have the election, but not the same candidates. But at that time it was still very interesting. So we set up we started to work with the characters who did a lot of social work in the area, and they organized usually something very unique for Hong Kong, a district council, so election forum in public space in Hong Kong. And they did it almost on Central Street, so in those places, and we teamed up, and students developed their projects, let's say almost finished projects, right? And we would organize them with the NGO these district council election forums where the different candidates would come, and then students would present also their projects, and then to lobby, because you have to lobby before the elections, right? And you can imagine all the students that were from in China, right? So usually, I think it's not usually you don't have so much, right? So kind of to understand, because Hong Kong has this kind of still a certain kind of interesting vibrant civil society. So it looked like this, right? So there are different candidates invited, right? And to understand also for students who makes decisions somewhere, we talk about this in books, we read theories, but then to really see what does actually a district council in Hong Kong think, because we find very interesting for our research. Sometimes maybe police supported us much more than maybe even the elected district council, because we feel like we are competing, we are doing this and this, right? So to understand those dynamics, maybe as a foreigner also, that if you engage with real people and the real processes, right? It's an action research basically, right? Could talk about more action research, right? And then basically on Central Street, in the middle of the neighborhood, students have their projects, mix of Master of Architecture, Master of Urban Design students show their project, and this is one of the district council candidates before the election. Oh, if you would be elected, don't you feel like, for example, there's a market building, on top of the market, the upper floor is always empty. Okay, they move to the street hawkers into the market, the upper part, nobody wants to go there, of course. And we would think, okay, what should we do there? Maybe a library or some other things. And that later also they may use that space after those events, right? And students at the same time they would do their design, Master of Architecture design projects, as usual students would do, right? But they were basically engaged in this entire process the whole time, right? Then the last step of that project before the pandemic, moving towards the pandemic, right, was an opportunity in Hong Kong. We have an urban renewal authority, and they work, as I said, sometimes a bit kind of building kind of huge blocks to get money for the city and maybe pay out salaries. I don't know, but maybe more like a engine of growth machine, right, and gentrification. But then they got so much criticism that they make a strategy review in 2011, and what they did, one of the good things they did was creating an urban renewal fund to create community projects and so on to reunite the communities in urban renewal areas. And so we thought like, oh, that's interesting because we did this with projects already, but with very little funding and so on. So what we did, we applied together with Caritas, because usually an NGO has to lead that, often with many charities and so on. So we applied for this funding, and our students, second year students that were in the Magic Tables project, they helped to make the drawings for that, right? And preparing for the social workers the application, right? And we got actually the money, which was kind of nice amount of reasonable amount, right? And which allows us to not only come once a year to have a beautiful public space event, but actually to set up a community studio which would run basically on an everyday basis, and not only we're sitting in the university and once in a while come by and say like, oh, nice, what are you doing here? Like, we have some answers for you. But we could employ 2 young people for 2 years. One was architecture bachelor graduate, and one was somebody from social work. Exactly the idea of the project. Social spatial project, right? And they work basically every day in this community studio, running events, with talking with neighbors, and to build up like the friends of Shen Fun Lane, of that particular space, and so on, right? So I can show you this is basically this funding system, and we found in a side street from Center Street there were some empty stores. Because it's very steep there and not many people want to have this. But also we thought that this particular alley is quite beautiful because slower, more local people go through. And then we make a walk-up first because we had to show it to the funding organization how it would look like. So we did kind of tactical things with some tables and so on, so that they would see what this community studio would look like, right, for no money. And then we got basically the funding, and then students also will continue, also our master students and others, to use this as a home base, right, as our anchor in the neighborhood for other projects, right. So, and again, we continued with these things like during Moon Festival. So students, for example, designed like something temporary, but also with the idea, this space is not a fully public space, is a space that is owned by two ownership association of 2 high-rise, so over 100 people, and they can decide what's going to be there. And we have the money to make the whole design for the area, but they would say, okay, don't put plants in. If you if you put plants, because it looks like concrete piece, also like a very ugly space anyway. But if you bring plants and too many people come, mosquitoes come, and people sit there and they're loud, and I cannot sleep, or very, very interesting, because we always think like neighbors of the communities always in support of things that we feel would be beautiful, right? But it can be the other way around, right? And that's, I want to say, like, we don't want to have somebody sitting here. We don't want to have this place comfortable, basically, right? So one idea was that, okay, to try to convince them to say, well, we rent the biggest plants that we can get for the one day and put them into the space and transform the space basically as a real design action, right? And let people experience. So that rather than to say like, oh, you have the tree there, you have to have this, you have to have this, and they don't want it. We just put it here as a. We borrow those kind of plants, and then later we took them away, so that it's more like, oh, why the plants are away? This kind of idea, right? Anyway, that was behind that, the idea behind that project. Anyway, these were the typical events that we always organize together with charities and so on, that we get the kids involved and so on, and the parents, and then we Caritas worked a lot to build up this self-help, or this group of ladies that started to plant around the area, the friends of that wing. And then the pandemic came, and then there's another story. Just to say, I was in a little bit interrupted, then came the, not civil war, but the kind of very special time in Hong Kong, 2019, and so on, right? While we were doing this project, we were doing this not only in this neighborhood, we did it basically in 3 neighborhoods, because this one was in the center, relatively many people that have apartments there, more quite middle class, university, quite close, quite well educated. So we did another project in very far away Newtown, which has a totally different social dynamic, and another one in Kowloon. Basically, Hong Kong has 3 totally different areas, and basically in all of those 3 areas we try to, also as part of our action research, to know how these different things work. And then we felt like during the pandemic we already thought like, oh, what we do afterwards. And then we felt like, okay, we have to upscale this, right? And we worked with others together. And for that one, we worked with organizations called Very Hong Kong. There's a lot of events and projects in Hong Kong, very resourceful. And then we had the idea to get a multiplication effect. Because now more and more, I come to almost that. To have a multiplication, now more and more interesting, people really interested in placemaking and so on, but not that we always have to come there, but to work in different districts and basically make a program with Very Hong Kong together for NGOs. Hong Kong has many NGOs, and but usually what they do, they are mostly social workers, but they don't have much kind of spatial experience, right? Many of those projects are actually not necessarily so difficult, right? Not putting in compounds. We wanted to do something that's very easy, everybody can copy, right? And not expensive. But could they do those things themselves? So basically, we made a project for 60 NGOs as multiplicators in over 2 years in 3 areas, and where this Very Hong Kong that worked with us together would make a program for the social workers. Each NGO sent 1 or 2 people, youngsters, to work together in each neighborhood. So basically, each neighborhood 20, right? 20 organizations, and these organizations usually they don't know each other, right? So one is fighting for women rights, one is doing something for ethnic minorities, one is doing something for this. But they usually happen that they never were talking with each other or knowing each other. And rather than kind of maybe if they take part in this kind of course, right, then they are both together and they develop their own placemaking project, and then we have a big festival where they basically present their projects, and then they can take this knowledge back to their organization. And so we work basically with 60 organizations and 3 districts, and then also the idea that this could move on, and so we call it Space Plus, and then we moved to different areas, and in this one also because at that time I was responsible for our School of Architecture, so I felt like we did a lot of public space projects, but then I worked also with our design teachers from the architecture programs, and they built and always like some structures and so on, so that we have architecture students, study students, design students, and the different NGOs coming. So that was the last that we did in that direction. Now, of course, coming back after all this to this proximity, living well with density and so on, this one is only like a small thing about the public spaces. Of course, we should also think about bigger scales. Currently, what's going on in the city now is a government, also with central government from China, probably pushing, we have to do something for the youngsters, otherwise they'll make trouble. And also we need to have a solution for the housing problem, right? So the government at the moment launched 3 years ago, a program to build 300,000 new housing units in the next 10 years, right? It's quite big, you know? So, but I think we did courses with students for Newtown, for example, to design in Newtown, and for 150,000 people, and it's almost half built it already because China is fast, right? So this program is quite interesting. So we also have a relatively close link to the Secretary for Housing, who's an architect also and quite engaged. And for them, upscaling is relatively easy because they have so many housing estates through the whole city, and as I said, they have 459 housing estates across the territory. And what they did now, which I find quite interesting, positive, is that they are not building only the housing, but they are also looking at well-being after the pandemic. And so they work with Young Architecture Office. Now what we have in Hong Kong after our project and so on, not because of me, but there was a trend of many people that did things like we did, other did, and we have now architectural practices that do basically full-time what we did as this kind of university projects, and actually very successful. And one of those practices, 2 people that were in New York and now came back from Hong Kong, they developed this kind of well-being guide for the government with this kind of idea to link public space community facilities, particularly in view of also with the community. They had many of those community interactions and so on, similar to what I showed before, and created then this kind of 8 documents we can download as toolkits. So if you Google or housing well-being HK, you can download for free. And many of those have good ideas like, if you have aging society and let's say you wait for the bus, or you need this, or you feel alone, what you can do and how that can be designed, and how the housing authority people or estate managers and so on can help. So I think now they do a lot of those kind of community actions and so on that they didn't do in older days and so on, right? So as I said, I don't want to claim that it was somehow related to our project, but it was more like a bubbling up of a culture where a lot of young young people started those things, and now this is more integrated into the government process. You have also private developers that come into public housing estates, and this is good or bad. And you have new towns that the government is planning now. Particularly, and this is the last thing I show that this is Shenzhen in the back, and in the front is Hong Kong. Hong Kong always shows it back to Shenzhen, and Shenzhen came as close as possible. But now Hong Kong, organically, because it's part of China, it's going to develop more in this direction. It makes also sense. Also, it's a question what to do with these kind of landscapes and so on. But there's a big project for a technopole together with housing and so on. And we became very interested in this kind of huge project. It's also not so far from our university, and we're thinking like, how can we contribute to the discussion, not only like a small public space, but how a master plan should look like. And you see in that master plan, I feel like, I don't know how you would think about it, but probably from what we learned when we over the last decades, is probably we wouldn't necessarily maybe plan a big area like this only as a techno park, and have some housing here and have some other things here, right? I mean, if you see what Barcelona is doing or what other cities are doing, right? Or what Hong Kong was in the past, I mean, it's totally, it's totally mixed use, and that's why it's an economic engine, because of the vicinity, of the proximity, everything come together, right? This is basically an anti-Hong Kong, right? Almost, right, from the design. And so we felt like for that one, we try to leverage on a network that we have with different, also through a workshop, design workshop for a week. Now that we can do it in person again, and as you mentioned, I'm part of a network of 25 universities in Europe and Asia. So in Europe is UBC Barcelona, Delft, Lausanne, Lisbon, Stuttgart, and so on. In Asia, and so on. And then we invited them to come over to work with 120 students of this. Also to have a more international debate on what's going on there. Because even, for example, international companies, there's no competition. Because you think like Hong Kong, or no international competition, right? And Hong Kong is a world city, right? But no international competition, why? And many, we talk with people from the European Chamber of Commerce, for example, they would be happy to invest in that area, but they don't know what's going on, right? And so on. So and even developers feel like, we want to invest here, but we don't want to build this, right? This is 30 years ago, right? So then we try to leverage this kind of workshop. Similarly, like we do workshops here. So I just showed some pictures, right? Another thing that brings us back, you remember this Sao Paulo image of informal settlement, another new town, right? You see here a hole here, right? So in the government plan, there's a brown area in the middle that's an urban village. And the government is not touching it, it's not destroying it, but it's also not integrating at all. It just plants around it. And we don't want to burn our fingers because it's kind of very difficult to deal with this. Let's plant something around. But then you think about they talk about 15-minute city and so on, but they're not studying this because I understand them why they do this, there's certain reasons, right? But to me, it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, as a university, of course, we should do it differently. That's why we're a little bit provocatively, we talk about weaving, living and working together and so on, right? But also there's this kind of provocative, the heart basically, right? And students, of course, were working on this. And then we had, this is the network here. We have Fadu, I just was at our partner in Buenos Aires and in Bogota. Otherwise, it's all in Asia and Europe. And for the workshop, also some other came over. And then basically they were looking each time at synergies. We said like, okay, we cannot do a master plan for the whole area, but instead of doing this, we always pair something, like maybe think about urban village and technology, or housing and this, or this and this, right? How can we bring things together that are not thought together, right? And then we invited field trip, right? And we will have our field trip, right? Presentation of students, and then we made a big event in the central market that is basically like in Manhattan downtown in downtown Hong Kong. There's a central market with food and beverage and bars and so on. And in the middle of it, we made a public debate, invited the Secretary for Housing and people from European Union, different consuls, people from pharmaceutical industry, but as well as more people from community side and so on to discuss. And students were basically presenting to them, and then they round tables for that. So we thought that's kind of nice. And then with this topic also on future living, how we can link housing better, we also just finished with our friends in Lisbon, the conference. It's the same topic. With this network, we always try, because it's Asia and Europe, and not everybody can fly to the other side. So we always try to have one event on that continent, one there. So we have, for example, the conference in Lisbon and the workshop in Hong Kong. Next year will be probably the conference in Tsinghua University and the workshop in Lisbon. So, or before we were in Barcelona. So to bring people together. And what was interesting, we invited also our Secretary for Housing to there to maybe get to know also how in Europe people are planning, and she gave a talk there. So bring together, and also in Lisbon they invited the mayor and so on to say, well, of course we do this kind of small placemaking process, but we also understand this will not change the entire city, right? I find this very valuable and so on, but at the same time, we need to cross scale and think in different scales. Right? Okay, this is basically all which I have here, and then of course we will have discussions. I want to say, no, this was basically this, and this is this, right? Here I find kind of nice those two things, right? And I would love to see how we can have a discussion, and I'm really here to learn with you together. And can I still play a video? Or yeah, it's okay. It's just kind of 3 minutes, but it gives maybe a little bit of a sense of this. Seems like the sound doesn't work, but it doesn't really matter because it's just some music and stuff. Okay, these are basically from this event. Okay, we don't have a sound, but you can get maybe an idea of this event that we did. These are all my master students, right? Oh yeah. I think that one of the students is now for 5 years working for UN Habitat in Nairobi. So during daytime it's more playful, very playful for our students, our kids and so on, right? In the evening, the atmosphere very much changed. You see, this is like a stage that is between two markets, so it's really in the heart of the community, right? And usually people wouldn't stay there, they would just walk through. No? But then evening changed now. And then we had these kind of workshops and so on with residents, kids and so on. So also these students from mainland China, they were just basically 3 weeks in Hong Kong, and it's a kind of very fast way to. In the evening, you see like there are all these kind of secondary school kids with their parents, and then the people are here and they are interviewed, right? In the moon, in the right place, right? And then the discussions in between, right? And then food, of course. Today probably would be a problem to use so many films with children as a difficult. Stop, I think.
It's going.
Buffering a little bit. Maybe coming back. No, if not. I mean, most of this one you've seen. I think not so much new other things that happens, just kind of a little bit more of the atmosphere. If not, maybe I go, because I think you get an idea of what this is about. Maybe I try to show you the other one, which was in the Magic Tables a year later. We have a website with over 80 videos with all the communities, and also a website. I can show you. And students had to, with long hair, and more battery. And students were thinking, they always had to get the inspiration for their project from one particular street in the neighborhood. No? So one was, for example, those steamers. There was an old shop that still made those old steamers, so therefore they used that. And they had to, of course, they had to have light for the food because you don't eat something that's dark, so at night need to be. And as I said, those students, they have never built anything, no? Because in Hong Kong, if you're in a public housing estate, you're not building anything out of wood or something like that. And because of the music, of course, then even more people came. You can see. Some of the musicians, this one for example, a very famous singer from Taiwan. And in the evening, they would then bring out the source food, all from the tofu lady that is also interviewed in the first time of the year. And then we asked them also to bring photos of the neighborhood, and so each group had to think about how they engage, and then people could vote their favorite. Anyway, so this was also with undergrad students basically. So we had master, PhD. Okay, thanks very much.